So tonight, we are now hosting our third, I believe, annual lectureship here at Valley Beth Shalom in partnership with CSUN. And it's just my real joy and pleasure to have you here tonight, because we here at Valley Beth Shalom honor and value learning of all types and want to be a center for Jewish culture and Jewish life here in the Valley. So it's my pleasure now to introduce to you Dr. Jennifer Thompson, who is the Assistant Professor of Jewish Studies and Interdisciplinary Program and is the Maurice Amato Endowed Professorship in College of Humanities, for whom this lecture is named. Please give a round of applause and welcome Dr. Thompson to the dais to introduce our speaker tonight.
So as Rabbi Farkas said, welcome to the third annual Maurice Amato Foundation Lecture in Jewish Ethics. Is this good? Okay. We're pleased to present Professor Don Seaman of Emory University, who will speak on the ethics of ingathering, race, religion, and the dilemmas of Ethiopian immigration to Israel. So why this topic? If you've been following the news, you've heard about the big topic of immigration in America. And so we hear about people using rhetoric, relying on ideas where they may think they know things, but maybe these things aren't really true or they're only partially true. And social science, combined with ethics, helps us to take a step back from this kind of rhetoric and these ideas that are partial and maybe purposely incomplete. And, sorry? Okay, and bring to it a more holistic and analytical view. In the case that we'll hear about tonight, sorry? Okay, how about right here? Okay. In the case that we'll hear about tonight, it's a different situation than what we're hearing about in the American news, because it's the case of Ethiopian immigration to Israel. But looking at a parallel case helps us to see what we could apply to the American case and perhaps come away with more helpful and ideally more humane ways of looking at our own situation. That's the goal of this lecture series each year, is to give us a chance to apply the tremendous resources of Jewish tradition to contemporary situations in a scholarly and analytical way. And my hope is that each year when you come, and thank you for coming, that you will be able to leave this lecture feeling like you understand something about our society a little bit better and about how to live in our society a little bit better. And if you don't feel that you did that, then in the Q&A session, please ask the questions that will help you to do that. So we could not have this lecture without the resources that the Maurice Amato Foundation has provided and the Amato family, and we're very grateful to them. I don't know if any of them are here tonight, but we appreciate them nonetheless. We're also very grateful for Valley Beth Shalom's help. They've been so generous in logistics and all kinds of contributions each year that make this possible for us. And thank you to all of you for being here, to your commitment to learning, your interest in Jewish ethics, and for wanting to improve our society together. And so we're also grateful to Don Seaman for coming to LA, and to, to share his knowledge and analysis with us. Professor Seaman has written the only scholarly account of Ethiopian immigration to Israel in his book, One People, One Blood, Ethiopian Israelis and the Return to Judaism, available from Rutgers University Press. And he's also written many journal articles and book chapters. He is associate professor in the Department of Religion and the Institute for Jewish Studies at Emory University. He's widely published in the areas of Jewish thought and social anthropology of modern Israel, and is the co-editor of Contemporary Anthropology of Religion, a book series at Palgrave Macmillan. His late grandparents, Joseph and Rachel Cass, were members of VBS. Let me welcome him up here, and I will go man the computer, woman the computer.
Thank you. I want to thank Professor Thompson, who was a student of ours at Emory, and it's really nice to see you succeeding so well here. I want to thank Valley Beth Shalom. As you mentioned, my grandparents were members here. They live just up the street on Natick Avenue, and I'd like to dedicate this talk to their memory. Rosh Chodesh Tov. Tonight is the eve of the new Hebrew month of Adar. Purim is coming around the corner. The rabbis say when Adar begins, we have to celebrate a little bit. So hopefully this will be some sort of celebration.
Okay. Let me try to not hit you in the face. I've been asked to adjust this.
Okay. So I'll be perfectly honest. I'm only going to be willing to do this so much, but I will try to start off at least on a good note. Okay. Sure. This is a talk in 4 parts. I'll talk for maybe 45 minutes to an hour, and then we'll have plenty of time for questions and conversation. If anything I say is really unclear, feel free to interrupt me, but let's save the main conversation for afterwards. This is a talk in 4 parts, as I mentioned. The first part is called A Funeral in Addis Ababa. It was a very rainy summer day in Addis Ababa in 1992. Addis Ababa is the capital of Ethiopia. You have a map here. You see that it's not very far from Israel, although it's a far distance to walk. I had just arrived in Ethiopia a short time ago. I was a graduate student coming to do preliminary research towards my dissertation in social anthropology at Harvard University. And I took a taxi and made my way to the neighborhood of Meganenia in Addis Ababa, which is the neighborhood where the Israeli embassy is, the largest embassy in Ethiopia. And not far from the Israeli embassy was the compound, as it was called. It was called the Nakoj Compound. It was the North American Conference of Ethiopian Jews, an organization some of you may have heard of, who were the primary sponsors of a kind of mini camp or a little city within a city for people who were waiting in Addis Ababa to try to receive Israeli immigration visas and permits. Some of them had been waiting there for several years, and it was my desire to go and interview people and find out what was going on with them. I'll talk a little bit more about my work as an anthropologist in a little bit, but I want to start by jumping right into the story. And on that cold, rainy day, because July in Addis Ababa is actually wintertime, it's wet and cold, and you're at a very high altitude, so I was sort of huffing and puffing. And the streets are all dirt or mud streets, and it had been raining, so there were furrows of water going down the street on either side, sometimes quite torrential. I think I saw a dead cow floating by at one point. There's a tremendous amount of poverty in Addis Ababa, but it's also a beautiful city. It's very green. People think it's desert, but it's not. It's a beautiful green country. And as I approached the compound, there was a tumult, and I sort of saw from a distance away that a young woman had been, it seemed, hit by a car. And this was not uncommon, because at this time, the people who were awaiting immigration visas to go to Israel, many of them were coming down out of the countryside. They weren't familiar with traffic, and sometimes they got hit by cars. And this young woman was hit by a car when I was still, I don't know, maybe 30 or 40 yards away, and she was lying on the ground. And the car tried to drive off, but some people grabbed it and stopped it and held the driver. And as I got closer, people came running up to me. And they said, "She's one of yours. You take her. Go with her to the hospital. They'll be more likely to see her if a Farenj comes along, a white person, a foreigner. The hospital will be more likely to take her if you go with her. She's one of yours." Now, that's an incredible moment. First of all, it's a life and death moment. And within the next 2 or 3 minutes, without me really knowing what had happened, they had commandeered this car, the same car that had hit her. They sort of threw the driver out of the car. They lifted her up into the back. It was kind of like a pickup truck sort of a thing. They loaded her into the back with a bunch of people, and they pulled me aboard, and they took off for the hospital. Across the dirt roads with the torrential rain and bumping and jostling, and it took quite a while to get to Black Lion Hospital, which is one of the big hospitals in Addis Ababa. By that time, it was clear she had internal bleeding. We got to the emergency room, which was really, it's like a shed. It wasn't, I mean, it's not, you shouldn't picture sort of a modern hospital. It was a shed with a line of people standing outside. And they were said emergency room in English, and they were standing there because it was lunchtime and the doctors were out to lunch. There was nobody manning the emergency room. But the people who were with me grabbed me and sort of pushed me to the head of the line, and they pushed me inside this shed, and they said, "You tell the doctor that she's yours." And sure enough, with just a little bit of pressure, because they were having lunch after all, but with a little bit of pressure, the doctors listened to me because I just yelled at them in English. I mean, I was American. I'm an ugly, ugly American. And they said, okay. So they came out, they interrupted their lunch, and they took the woman inside, and they started working on her. And she died. Now, you live moments like that. They change you. They're difficult moments. But as a scholar, you also have to learn something from moments like that. And so I found myself reflecting upon what it meant to show up in this place and sort of without anybody really knowing me or understanding who I was or what I was connected to, sort of grabbing me and saying, "She's yours, go with her to the hospital." And in fact, it worked. If she had shown up there without a pharynge, I'm sure she would have still been sitting on line there 2 hours later when the doctors finished their lunch, and she would have been dead anyway. But at least they tried. I went into the hospital to try to find a telephone because there was an American doctor, Rick Hodes, who's been written about, who I knew in Addis Ababa, and I wanted to get him to try to come down before I knew that she had been killed. And I don't know if they were giving me the runaround or if it was for real, but they said there's no phone here. And they sent me across the street to find a phone in some local shop. By the time I got back, she had died. And the next couple of days were devoted to preparing for her funeral, preparing the body, which I helped with, and then a massive funeral, which we'll talk about a little bit later. What does it mean she's one of yours? What does that mean? What does it mean to claim or to have claimed about you that you have some intrinsic special connection to another person that you've never met, and that somehow that connection has life and death consequences? Because if there was any hope that she was going to be saved from this accident, it was somehow because I was there and she was connected to me. Although it was also somehow because of that connection that she had gotten into trouble in the first place, because she had left her village somewhere out in the countryside and come down to the capital to seek aid and to try to get immigration visas from Israel, and had been hit by a car in the capital, 16-year-old girl. So life and death, life and death. And it's impossible to predict at any given moment when it's going to be life and when it's going to be death, but we're all sort of involved in this moment of contact when they say, "She's yours." And the fact that she was mine, whatever that meant, was brought home to me over the next days because I was a foreign Jew. I knew a little bit of Hebrew. They asked me if I would read Psalms at the cemetery. They didn't have somebody there who could read Hebrew. They asked me if I would help prepare the body for the burial because they didn't really have people who knew how to do that. And in preparing for the funeral, it became clear to me that that claim, "She's one of yours," was not a simple claim. It was a contested claim. It was a claim that not everybody agreed to. At that time, one of the other major presences in Addis Ababa, besides the NACOJ, this North American NGO, was the Joint Distribution Committee, or the JDC, and I sought their assistance, and they would have nothing to do with the funeral. They would have nothing to do with helping, anything having to do with this woman or this funeral, because from their point of view, and they said this to me quite clearly, she's not one of ours. She's not one of ours. And by that they meant that at that time, the Joint Distribution Committee and the State of Israel had decided that this particular group of people were not people who were eligible for immigration status to Israel, because they were thought to be people of Jewish ancestry whose parents, grandparents, sometimes great-grandparents had converted to Christianity. And that was precisely the fight that was going on at that moment, not just in Addis Ababa, but throughout the Jewish world. Who are these people? To whom do they belong? And who belongs to them? So I start with that story because I want to drive home the fact that claims about kinship, anthropologists call this kinship, it means family, it means a sense of connection, are moral claims. It's not just a statement about some genetic identity, it's a statement about who has an obligation to help you when you need help and who doesn't have an obligation to help you when you need help. And even if ideally we would like to say, well, of course, everybody has an obligation to help everybody, of course, we know that's not actually how the world works. Foreign states don't typically come to the aid of individuals in another country. And there was a claim to membership, there was a claim to belonging that was being made by this woman by virtue of the fact that she came to Addis Ababa, that she petitioned the Israeli embassy for immigration permission, and there was a counterclaim, a claim of non-belonging, of non-kinship, that was being made at that time by the dominant American Jewish community. NACO is a tiny little organization. The JDC is the mainstream organization, and by the Jewish Agency and by the government of Israel, for whom there was an important policy reason not to recognize those claims, not to help in the burial. Because, of course, if you help in the burial in any way, what is that going to do? That's going to give people the understanding that they are part of the family, that they do deserve help, and then who knows how many thousands of more people will come down from the countryside and get hit by cars, or not get hit by cars and have to be fed and housed and eventually taken on airplanes to Israel and fed and housed there and taken care of for years while they learn Hebrew or learn a trade or never learn a trade. So both sides to this argument had a lot at stake. Claims about belonging are usually claims that are made when somebody has something at stake. They're not just abstract claims. And as an anthropologist, that's what I was trying to figure out. I was trying to get my head around this whole imbroglio over immigration policy and to understand what was at stake for whom. Maybe in the interest of helping to sort out policy, not that the government of Israel was asking my opinion in particular, but even if I would have a limited impact on policy conversation, it would seem to me, or it seemed to me at the time, and it still seems to me, that there's a certain inherent value in getting the story straight and not just making pronouncements, getting the story straight. So who are these people? Where did they come from? What is their claim? What is the basis for rejecting their claim? And how do you find that out? What kinds of information are valid to make that case? Is it enough that they showed up and said, we belong? Is that enough? Does it require some kind of corroboration? Does it require a paper trail? Does it require oral testimony? What's necessary? How do you make a claim to membership that matters? And as easy as it is for us at a great remove to sort of take sides, and people feel one way or the other, or they think that the other side is sort of dense or morally obtuse. The question is, or the reality is, that in real time, it's not always so easy to figure out who belongs to whom and on what grounds that claim can be made? On what grounds that claim can be made? You have source sheets in front of you. If not, share with your neighbor. Just take a look at source number 1. We're going to read through a few of these. These are just quotes from field work that I did. They're all present in my book, which you're welcome to buy. It's on Amazon, but here you'll get a synopsis. A couple of days later, when I visited the compound again, there was a big demonstration outside. Maybe several hundred people were demonstrating. These were people who had come from the countryside more recently and weren't even receiving support at the Nakoj compound. In other words, so they were like two groups. They had all been denied immigration visas, but there were some who were receiving aid, and there were some who were not, because they came late and they hadn't been registered, and everybody was afraid that if you give help to more people who come, so what's going to happen? More people will come, and more people will come. Okay, so this was a group of people who were not receiving aid, and they were standing there, and they elected a representative who read out this poem, okay, which I transcribed and then translated. Okay, I'm just going to read a little bit of it, but you can read it here in source number 1. God of Israel, please help us. Make Zimna's heart kinder. We chose elders and sent to him. Who's Zimna? Zimna was the Jewish agency representative from Israel who was working in Addis Ababa to make determinations about who gets to go to Israel and who doesn't. And he himself was of Ethiopian origin. Okay, he was an Ethiopian Israeli who worked for the equivalent of the Israeli State Department and was sent back to Ethiopia to run this office and to make these decisions. And so now they're pleading with him. God of Israel, please help us. Make Zimna's heart kinder, trying to kind of shame him into making what they thought was the right decision. And they go on. They say, the wind and cold are killing us all. Please forgive us. We carry stones and beg you. You'll see a picture of that in just a moment. Make Doron, another Israeli administrator who was there from the Sachnut, give us the afternoon meal. You give us dinner. We people of Israel are suffering in poverty. We're weeping every morning. Zimna, please help us. Please be kind to us by smiling and reach out your hand to us. What a father and mother Zimna has. He's a sharpshooter. Most of our people have gone to Israel because of your kindness. Don't you feel sorry for those of us who are left behind? All right, what is the claim being made here? What do you think? What's the claim being made here? This is a political claim, this poem. Sorry? Yeah, so there's a not very veiled attack on Zimna, right? Why did you leave us behind and take those other? And by the way, I could not get an interview with him. He's one of the few people who just eluded my efforts to talk to him. But he was an important guy there. He really had life and death in the power of his pen, because if he crossed you off that list, you didn't get an immigration visa. So here they are appealing to him, but on what basis are they appealing to him? Right, so there's an unfairness going on. But of course, I have to say, I hope nobody's offended by this, but in 1992 and 1993 when I was there, everybody in Ethiopia wanted to leave. Okay, there was not one person who wanted to stay, not just Jews. And by the way, in between the 2 summers that I was there, everybody that I met who had spoken English, who I met on the first summer, was gone by the second summer when I get back. And you couldn't walk down the street without people asking you to sponsor their visa to the United States, which was not a simple thing to do. There was a bank account, you had to give a number, to sponsor an immigrant to the United States was not simple. But you couldn't walk any place without somebody stopping you and asking that. So everybody wanted to leave. So their argument is not just, well, some people got to leave, why can't we? They're making a more specific argument. Their argument is, we are like you. We are children of Israel. We call upon the God of Israel. We are Jews. That's the claim. We are Jews. You have an obligation to help us. At this point, that claim was not recognized. It was not recognized by Zimna, and it was not recognized by the state of Israel. So their claim was, we are Jews. That was the claim. So it's unfairness, but it's unfairness within a very specific understanding of who has obligations to whom. Okay, now. I'll tell you a very quick story. You see how close Israel is to Ethiopia. Can you go to the next clip? The Jewish community in Ethiopia is very ancient. It's been around for a very long time. Just the arrow there. Okay. No? There you go. Sure, you can make it a little bit bigger if you want. That's just a random picture I found on the internet. I didn't take it, but that's just a picture of a group of Ethiopians standing holding that book. Anybody know what that book is? That book is the Orit, or the Torah, written in Gez, in Ethiopic. That's fine. And, it's a very important central thing that was kept in a special ark inside the synagogue in the Ethiopian village. What do you notice about it? It's a little bit different than the Torah that you keep in the ark here, right? It's not written on parchment. It's written on paper. If you look more closely, you can't really see it here. It's not written in Hebrew. It's written in Gez. Okay, but it includes the Old Testament, what we call the Old Testament. But the biblical books that it includes are a little bit different than the typical Jewish canon. It includes some books that we think of as apocrypha, right? So there's both similarity here and difference with other Jewish communities, right? The difference is, you have to decide which are more impressive to you, the similarities or the differences. Right? There's no mathematics that makes that decision. That's an impression you have to make. So if you think, look, the Jews in Yemen and the Jews in Spain and the Jews in Poland, they all had a Sefer Torah that looked more or less similar. Right? The difference between an Ashkenazi Sefer Torah and a Sephardic Sefer Torah is a couple of letters. It's not a big deal. So you might be most impressed by the differences. Say, look, this is not a Torah. We don't recognize this as being us. But you might say, no, that's an unimportant difference. What's important is that they have the same words, it's the same books, more or less, the Saturday Sabbath, and they circumcise their children, and they don't eat pork, and all those similarities. And they call themselves Israelites. So this was not, what I described to you in Addis Ababa in 1993 was not a new story. For 150 years, Western Jews and the Beta Israel, or the Jews of Ethiopia, had been wrangling over who belongs to whom. And it wasn't just one-sided. It's not just that Western Jews were trying to decide whether to accept Ethiopian Jews. Ethiopian Jews also had to decide whether to accept Western Jews. It goes both ways. Because if the question is, are you members of the family? So both sides have to kind of accept that they're members of the family. Okay, and this started before the State of Israel. The State of Israel just sort of made this whole thing more intense. But this wrangling existed beforehand. Can you turn the next picture, please? I would like you to take a look. We're going to skip source number 2 for the interest of time, but if you skip to source number 3 for a second. Okay, this is an illustration from a missionary journal from the 1860s. And it portrays Beta Israel, or a Jewish village there in the background with the conical huts, right, which were very typical, not just of Jews, but of everybody in that region of Ethiopia. And you see in the foreground these people taking their clothes off and bathing in the river. That was because bathing in the river, purity practices, were considered very, very central to the Beta Israel practice and identity in Ethiopia. The stereotype very often of the Beta Israel by their non-Beta Israel neighbors was they smell like water because they are bathing so much. They bathe more than the Christians do. And the reason they bathe more than the Christians do is because they're following the laws of purity, more or less, that are described in the book of Leviticus. Which, by the way, I don't care how from you or your grandparents are, but none of you people from Eastern Europe were, following the laws of Leviticus. For most Jews, that ended with the destruction of the Second Temple, or at least within a few hundred years of the destruction of the Second Temple. But for Jews in Ethiopia, the bathing and not touching items of impurity was very significant. If you touched a non-Beta Israel person, if you touched a non-Jewish person, in very strict circles, you had to purify yourself for a week. That meant leaving the village, living in a special hut, eating lentils to purify, inside and outside, and then going to the river and washing. If you touched a corpse, if you touched non-kosher food, if you ate non-kosher food. So there was a lot of washing going on, and the missionaries who arrived in the 1860s to Ethiopia specifically to missionize Jews, I mean, that's what their purpose was, that's what they noticed. Now, this is a question of a family, who's kin and who's not. It's an old problem. The first major missionary to reach Ethiopia for this purpose in 1860 was a guy named Henry Aaron Stern. Sounds Jewish. In fact, he was a Jewish convert to the Anglican Church, and he was the head of, or he was the person chosen to go to Ethiopia by an organization that was sometimes known as the London Jewish Society, but whose full title was the London Society for the Promotion of Christianity Amongst the Jews. Okay, you could turn that into an acronym, I guess. It would be, one of the major organizations of presidents of whatever. And so he was a converted Jew who went to Ethiopia to find Jews and convert them. And he's important because his writings were the first time that most Jews living in the West, in Europe and in North America, came to know in any way that there was a Jewish community in Ethiopia and to become interested in them. So paradoxically, although he converted some people to Christianity, he also forged the first links between Beta Israel and Jews in the West. Okay, look at what he has to say in source number 3. He's talking about his first meetings with Beta Israel, who he met in villages. He says, "To our inquiry whether they had any desire to learn, they replied with an imploring expression in their black and lustrous eyes, 'Oh yes, oh yes.' We then informed them that we were falashas. The announcement that we were falashas afforded them ineffable delight. And with their dark eyes riveted on me, they gazed and gazed, till at last their silent amazement vented itself in the ejaculation, 'He looks indeed like a son of Israel,' like a true child of Jacob." In other words, he looks like a Jew, right? This is Henry Aaron Stern depicting what the Ethiopian Beta Israel were saying about him. Right? So he meets them in the village, and he mentions, every sentence, he mentions how dark they are and how black they are, but their response to him, he says, "Oh, he looks Jewish. He looks Jewish." I mean, it's really kind of interesting. "In leaving, they all accompanied us, and we had several times to entreat them to return before they could be persuaded to tear themselves away from their unexpected friends." Okay, what was he teaching them? What was he teaching them? The gospel. Right? He's teaching them the gospel. This missionary group were the first people to translate the New Testament and the Hebrew Bible into Amharic, the spoken language. Right? So because the Bible was read in Ethiopian Gez, which was a language that nobody understood. It was sort of like Latin, High Latin in Europe. So these missionaries had an incredible impact, because first they were the first translators of the Bible, and they had these books which they were handing out to people right and left, and they showed up in these villages and said, "We're Jews like you," and then proceeded to teach them the gospel. Okay? Now look at this paragraph closely. On what grounds does Henry Aaron Stern say to these people, "You are like me, we are part of the family, we are kin"? What's the ground of Henry Aaron Stern saying we are kin? Right, so he uses the word. He says, "You're falashas, everybody's falashas. We're very happy," right? But which by the way is not a nice word, right? But at that time, that's the word they used, okay? So, but what's the basis for the claim? You look like us, right? I mean, right? It's interesting. He doesn't say, "You guys look like Jews." He says that they looked at him and said, "You look like a Jew." Which is kind of strange, because most of them had never seen a European before. But presumably, although they had never seen a European, they knew that this was a Jewish European. And in some places, Henry Aaron Stern does say, "Oh, look, they look Jewish." Right? So the claim to being part of the family for Henry Aaron Stern was racial. But race plays a peculiar role here, because it's what brings them together and it's also what separates them. And if you read through his diaries, like he said, some of the Beta Israel came and they said they were Kohanim. They said they were descendants of Aaron. And his response to them was, "That can't be true, you're black." right? So, there's this like funny thing going on where he says, you're Jews because you kind of look like us, but you're not Jews in the same way because you're black, you're African. So he wants it both ways, right? He wants membership, but also a certain distance, and he wants to use that sense of family to convert them. And in fact, the London Society had a very distinct theology. They thought it was important for Jews to stay Jews, but just to believe in Christianity. In other words, on a national, ethnic, racial dimension, they were Jews. Hebrew Christians, they called them. Okay, so this was not like medieval Christianity. They said, you're going to stop being a Jew. They said this was very modern. This exists a lot nowadays. They said, you're going to be a completed Jew. You're going to be, a Jew who just believes in our Lord Christ. I mean, that's, the synagogue, right? But that's, that's what you're going to do. And he converted a certain number of people, not so many. Estimates are that no more than 1% of the population converted in any given year, but it didn't matter because he shook the bedrock foundations of their society. He knew the Bible better than their religious leaders did. He knew how to dispute and to make proofs out of verses, and this threw the whole Ethiopian Jewish community into complete upheaval. Some communities ran away. They just picked up their whole village and they fled. They went to different regions where the missionaries were not. Okay, some stayed and struggled with them. Some people converted. There were all sorts of different, but they were fighting over the same thing that people were fighting over in 1993 when I was there. Are you a member of the family or are you not? And what are the grounds for deciding that? Take a look at the next source number 4. Jennifer, can you do the next picture? This next one is Joseph Halevi. Joseph Halevi was a Jew who went to Ethiopia a little bit later in 1868. Because he had been reading these missionary reports, and the Alliance, you have to pardon my French, but the Alliance Israelite Française, or whatever it's called, Universal, sent him to Ethiopia to find out whether these people are really Jewish or not. Because if they are, well, we'll have to help them, we'll have to send them stuff, Are they Jewish? And this is a picture of a kes, of a religious leader, in Nazrat Elite, where I did field work when I was actually a BA student many years ago, hence the black and white. But Joseph Halevi has the following thing to say. He also describes his first meeting with Ethiopian Jews, and he says, "Oh, my brethren, I am not only a European, I am like you, an Israelite." Sound familiar? Right? But by now, people were skeptical, right? And he says, I would show up in these villages, I would say, oh, I'm a Jew, and they would say, the last time people came here, they started with the New Testament and the Trinity, and pardon us, but we know that's not Jewish. So people were already skeptical. Okay, so he goes on. I come not only to trade in Abyssinia, but to inquire of the state of my co-religionists, in conformity with the desire of a great Jewish association existing in my country. You must know, my dear brethren, that I am also a Falasha. Sound familiar? But now he continues, I worship no other God than the great Adonai, and I acknowledge no other law than the law of Sinai. I'm from. Okay, and he was an observant Jew. Okay, what is his claim to brotherhood, to kinship based on? Right, it's very interesting. If you go through all of his diaries, yeah? Right, he never says, oh, you look like us. We look like you. He never makes those racial claims. He always says, you keep the same laws as we do. We have the same Sabbath as you. We have the same dietary, right? For him, the basis to a claim of kinship, of brotherhood, is shared religious identity. Has nothing to do with physical form. I don't know what he believed about origins. Maybe he believed that everybody was descended from Abraham. I have no idea. But that wasn't the claim that he made in the here and now. He said, look, we share the same religion. And by the way, yes? He meant I'm a Jew. He was just trying to use a word that he thought they were, because the word Jew didn't exist in Ethiopia. The word Jew was a term used for Christian heretics. Because there was a whole branch of the Orthodox Church in Ethiopia that kept the Saturday Sabbath. And by the way, all Christians in Ethiopia have circumcision of infant boys. They don't eat pork, right? So it's a very kind of Jewish church in a way. But if you were a Christian and you called another Christian Ayhud, which means a Jew, that was an insult. That meant you're a Judaizer. You're not really a Christian. That was an insult, okay, which they traded amongst themselves. So you didn't walk up to somebody in polite company and say, "Are you a Jew?" They didn't know what that meant. But you said, "Are you an Israelite, or are you a Falasha," which was a kind of ethnic name that people used. Okay? But it's a very different claim. This is a claim based on a shared covenant, shared religious practice. Now, which is more important to you, right? Most of the people in the audience here are probably Jews. Think about what it means to you when you say that you're a Jew or that someone else is a Jew. Do you mean we share religious observance? Maybe we share a history. Maybe we share an ethnicity. Maybe some of you mean we share a family. Maybe we share a race. I don't know. People mean different things when they say that. But today, it's much harder to claim that what binds Jews together is shared religion, because it's not clear that we all share the same religion. And there are a lot of Jews who don't claim any religion. By the way, I'll jump ahead. What is the law of return in the state of Israel? What does it say? Who's entitled to move to Israel under the law of return? It says, so there are two things. You have to have a Jewish grandparent, because that was the Nuremberg laws. But then how do you define who's a Jewish grandparent? Okay? It's not that they aggravate you or whatever. No, sorry, God forbid. But the definition of a Jewish person under the law of return is anybody born to a Jewish mother or converted to Judaism, it doesn't specify how or by whom, which is the source of lots of turmoil, who does not adopt another religion. And that last clause is crucial, because it means you can be completely 100% born Jew, but the moment you adopt Christianity, what does the state of Israel say? Sorry, you've sold your birthright in that sense, right? We don't have that responsibility to you. Now, if you just said, I'm a Christian, but I have a Jewish grandparent, that's different. Then you get in, right? Because we take in grandchildren because of the Holocaust and whatever. But if you yourself are the convert, and in particular to Christianity, because nobody ever asks, are you a Buddhist, or something, right? We're not sure if it's a religion, we don't know. But if in your interview, as they interview you, and you say, oh, by the way, I'm moving to Israel to fulfill my faith in my Lord Jesus or whatever, they don't give you citizenship. They don't let you come. They don't pay for the plane ticket. Okay, so what happens in modern Israel today is an interesting mix of these two. Because you don't have to share a religion. You could say I'm a communist. You could say I'm an atheist. You could say I hate religion. That's not a problem. You just can't have a different religion. The great historian Jacob Katz once said, the Jews are people with a religion unique to themselves. Right? That was who's a Jew? The Jews are people with a religion unique to themselves. In other words, you can't separate what it means to be a Jew by nationality or ethnicity from what it means to be a Jew by religion completely. You can separate, but not completely. And that's messy. That's why we have fights. That's why we're fighting about it to this day, right? Who's a Jew? It's really who's a rabbi, who gets to do a conversion. I mean, these are, I don't have to tell you, American Jews are up in arms a lot of the time, right? But the argument is an old argument. And it's a fair argument to have, because it's not obvious who's a member of the family. You have to make a decision. And what, if anything, can you do to lose membership or to gain membership? I mean, if you can become a Jew by converting, is there a way in which you can become a not Jew or unbecome a Jew? Well, for some purposes, it seems like the answer is yes. Right? I'm not talking about Jewish law here. I'm talking about the sociology of the Jewish community. At what point do you no longer count? We have a Hillel professional in the room, so I don't want to give you any heartache, but like no Hillel in the country has an organization under its roof of the Messianic Jewish student group. Why not? Not clear why. It's because there's some broad understanding of among Jews that that's a bridge too far. But is that set in stone? Will that be the same way in 20 years? I can't tell you. I mean, these things are fluid and they're evolving, and it has something to do with how many of those people there are and what kind of claims they make. Jews are people who fight about who's in the family. I mean, we fight in the family, because that's what families do, but we also fight about who's in the family. And Ethiopian Jews are not unique in that regard, or the conversation over Ethiopian Jews is not unique in that regard. It's just one of the most painful or most glaring of those fights, of those arguments. Now, Henry Aaron Stern and Joseph Halevi and all these Europeans start going to Ethiopia. They start teaching Christianity. They start teaching Rabbinic Judaism. They start teaching all these things. And little by little, what happens is what has been referred to by historians as the splintering of the Beta Israel, of the Ethiopian Jewish community. One part become Christian. One part become Jews like Jews in the West. They start using Hebrew. They start putting Magen Davids on top of the synagogue, which didn't exist before. They start doing rituals more similarly to what Jews in the West do. They stop having animal sacrifice, right? These kinds of things. And then there are people who just say, leave us alone. We don't want to change. We're going to keep doing what we're doing. But their position becomes untenable over time. There's not enough of them to support it. So over time, if you don't become a Christian, you wind up becoming a Jew more like the Jews in the West. That comes to a head in the 1970s when the Ethiopian community as a whole basically decides it wants to leave Ethiopia, wants to go to Israel. There's only one problem, or two problems. One is the government of Ethiopia won't let them out, and the second problem is the government of Israel won't let them in. Okay? And those problems are related because Israel doesn't want to have a fight with the government of Ethiopia. You know, this is still in the days when Israel thought, think of this, lasted for a long time. Its great strategic plan was that Israel would be allies with all the non-Arab states in the region. Who are the non-Arab states in the region? Think about this for a second. Ethiopia, right, controls the Red Sea. Turkey, which until recently seemed like a good bet, and Iran. Okay, those were the three powers that Israeli foreign policy was built on. Okay, and they didn't want to piss off the Haile Selassie, right? But in 1973, there's a communist revolution in Ethiopia. Haile Selassie is kicked out. The communists come in. The borders close. Jews can't leave. And the state of Israel is still not sure whether to accept them as Jews or not, so they can't come. That changes in 1973 when the chief rabbi, Ovadia Yosef, followed later by the chief Ashkenazi rabbi, affirms that the Beta Israel are Jews according to Jewish law. Later, Menachem Begin comes into power. He makes it a priority to bring people from Ethiopia to Israel, but it doesn't happen right away. These things take time. And so it's finally only in 1984 and 85, and you can turn the slide, that we have the first major immigration to Israel. It's called Operation Moses. Some of you probably remember. Really? That's what we're up to? No. Can you go back? No. Can you go back one? What's before that? Okay. Never mind. Okay, just go to the next one, please. I must have put it not in the right order. In Operation Moses, something like 8,000 Jews are airlifted to Israel, but they're airlifted to Israel not from Ethiopia, but from Sudan, its neighbor to the north. Ethiopia is in turmoil. There's famine. Remember Africa Aid. There's civil war, and millions of Ethiopians are on the move. They're trying to get out. There's millions of refugees, and along with those millions of refugees, there's 10 or 20,000 Jews who take the opportunity to leave. It's not easy. They have to walk across the desert. People get killed. They get killed by animals. They get killed by soldiers. They get killed by rebels. They get killed by hunger and thirst. A large proportion of the population dies. It's a terrible, terrible exodus. But those who survive make it to the Sudan, to the refugee camps there that are run by the United Nations, and sometimes they have to stay there for a year or so. But from those camps, the Mossad gradually pulls them out at night and airlifts them to Israel. 84, 85. It's a secret, 1984 and 85. Yes, it's supposed to be a secret operation. Sudan is, of course, a Muslim country. They're not supposed to be cooperating with Israel, but they're being leaned on by the State Department of the United States. Somehow or other, though, word leaks out. In Israel, they say it's the American Jews who leaked it. In America, they say it's the Israelis who leaked it. I don't know, but it leaked. The operation gets stopped. Anybody who's in Israel is in Israel. Anybody who's still in Ethiopia can't get out, and thousands of people are trapped in refugee camps and in border areas, and it's a terrible, terrible thing. And Israel launches a couple of secret operations to bring a few more people out, but basically that's the situation until 1991. Families are split. Nobody knows who's alive or who's dead. These were years when I began my field work in Israel, began to know the Ethiopian community very well. Everybody had family who had been left behind and had no way of knowing who was living, who was dead. Everybody was in mourning. Everybody had suffered tremendous, tremendous trauma. In 1990, it became clear that the government of Ethiopia was not going to survive. Rebel groups were moving in. Gradually, people began to try to move the remaining Jews into the capital with the understanding that somehow at some point when a window opened, it would be easier to get them out if they were all in one place. Finally, literally as the government of Ethiopia fell, the United States brokered an agreement with the various rebel groups who were mostly coming from the north, some of whom were Muslim. The US brokered a truce and said, we want you to hold off invading the capital for another day or two to give the Israelis a chance to get the Jews out, because nobody knew what would happen in the chaos of a revolution. The American Jewish community raised $30 million, which was paid as a personal bribe to Mengistu, the strongman who had run Ethiopia since the communist revolution, to tell his people to turn a blind eye as the Mossad started putting people on airplanes. He took the $30 million and ran to Uganda, where he spent the rest of his life. I think he's still alive. It's a nice place, Uganda, if you have $30 million. Israel launched Operation Solomon, which is this picture, which was the largest civilian airlift in history. 14,500 some odd people airlifted in 24 hours. On these airplanes that had the seats ripped out so they could just fit more and more people in. I was in Israel at the time. It was kept secret. Like, you just woke up one morning and there were Ethiopians all over the place, in the capital. I mean, it's like an Ethiopian village descended on Jerusalem. I mean, it was incredible. The airlift was over the Shabbat, so like Sunday morning, Saturday night, people just, woke up and there were all these immigrants that nobody knew where they came from. Everybody was jubilant. The Ethiopian community was jubilant. I rode around in taxis with people that I knew as they went from absorption center to absorption center looking for their relatives, see who was alive, crying. It was very emotional. Israel was jubilant. These were the days of the Zionism is racism resolution of the United Nations. Israelis felt justified. Look, we took these people from Africa, not as slaves, but as brothers and sisters. This was the triumph of Zionism. I was on a bus in Jerusalem, and they played the news, and some American yeshiva student stood up in English and yelled, "Ethiopia is finally Judenrein." There was a silence, on the bus. Everybody sort of nobody said anything, nobody knew what to say. It was a weird moment. So it was jubilation. And the newspaper said, the Jewish problem, I promise you, the Jewish problem in Ethiopia has been solved. I read a headline like that. The Jewish problem in Ethiopia has been solved. No more Jews in Ethiopia, everybody's out. Mission accomplished. The only problem was it wasn't so neat. And within a few days, it became clear that there were still a few thousand people left in Addis Ababa, in this camp, in this compound. And it became clear later what had happened, which was that just in the last moments, in that last 24 hours, a decision was made at the highest echelon of the Israeli government by probably Yitzhak Shamir at the time, because they had been keeping lists. And they had lists in Israel of who they thought was Jewish and who they thought was not, or who they thought was a descendant of a convert to Christianity. And at the last minute, they said to Shamir, who was prime minister, should we bring them? We're talking about an extra 4,000 people. And Shamir said, if they make a lot of noise and imperil the operation, bring them. Otherwise, no. So they went to people and they said, you're going to be on the next plane, and then they left them there. And this began to come out over the next days because some people in Israel, of course, had family who were there. In fact, put it this way, everybody who was in Addis Ababa at the time had some relatives who would come to Israel. So, you began having the demonstrations with the pictures of bringing, my mother, my sister, this kind of stuff. Initially, the newspapers talked about the people who had been left behind as anusim. You know what that term means? Anusim is the polite term for Moranos, right? People who were forced converts to Christianity. And by using that term, the Israeli media was signaling that these were people who had become Christian, but under severe duress, maybe under threat to their life. And therefore, what? Everything is a claim. Everything is a claim. If you use the word anusim, what does that imply for policy, for ethics? What does that imply if you're an Israeli? It implies that you're responsible for them. Because their conversion was forced. They're not traitors. They're not bad guys. They're just victims. And I remember it took about 24 hours in the news cycle, but very quickly, they started to change that language. And they started, instead of anusim, you began hearing also mitnatzrim, which is a wonderful Hebrew word. It means, it's a specific word for people who convert to Christianity. Like Eskimos have a lot of words for snow. Jews have a lot of different words for the different religions you can convert to. Right? You can mitnatzer, you can mitaslem, right? They're all different words for becoming a member of a different religion. But the policy or the ethics implication of using the term mitnatzrim was, we're not so sure they were forced. Maybe they just converted. And if they converted, what's our responsibility to them? Nothing. Not so much. And in fact, the Ethiopian community already in Israel was deeply split. And the split went something like this. If you had family there, you wanted to bring them. But if you didn't have immediate family there, you said, those people, it was hard for, and people would say this to me with very great passion. They said, it was hard for our family, we suffered, we didn't convert. Those people, they converted. We don't want them. We don't want to, right? It's a problem. And that was the beginning of what came to be known as the Falashmora problem. And those were the people that I went to visit in 1992 and 1993, and those were the people of that girl who was killed in that accident. And when she said, she didn't say, when people said to me about her, she's one of yours, that meant she's a Jew, you're responsible, take her, take care of her. And when the JDC representative said, we will have nothing to do with this funeral, what he meant was, no, not part of the family, not responsible for them. And these are decisions that had enormous implications, financial implications, geopolitical implications. The government of Ethiopia, which there was a new government now, they were friendly to the West, but they weren't so happy with the idea that there were people who were Christians who were being taken to Israel. Like it didn't sit well with the Ethiopian government because the Ethiopian church now got involved. They said, there are people. Right? Everybody wanted them except anybody that they wanted to be with. It was like a Woody Allen joke. And the people themselves said, no, we never converted. Right? They denied the whole story. No, it never happened. I don't know what they're talking about. Never happened. You can go to the next couple of pictures. This is a family in 1992. I knew the man in the middle, he had a son who came in 1991 to Israel. I knew the son very well, and when he heard I was going to Ethiopia, he handed me $100 of cash. He said, go, find my father, give this to him, and that's what I did. People handed me money, and I went around handing out money. $100 was worth a lot in Ethiopia. You could live for a while, not in great conditions. The father, nobody here knows him, right? I don't have to worry about confidentiality here. You never know. It's a small world. But the father was not, how did it happen that the son came to Israel and the father didn't come? Right? So the father had married a second wife who was a Christian woman and had a whole family with this other woman. And, whether he was entitled to come or not, that's, but he wasn't on the list. He wasn't on the list. So he was there. He was stuck there. Going to go to the next picture? And there were, story after story after story was that kind of thing. My sister is in Israel, I'm here. My children, I'm here. Oh, remember I said, right, remember in that poem he said, we're sitting with carrying stones in penitence. This is not a Jewish person, this is just a beggar in Ethiopia, but you see them carrying stones like that, it's a sign of penitence. The stone on the head, right? Okay, it's not so important for right now. Go ahead, please. The people who were left behind now, what was owed to them? So here's how it broke down. I'm going to end soon so we can have a conversation, but here's how it broke down. The government of Israel said, and the mainstream Jewish community in America said, they're not our problem. We didn't ask them to come to Addis Ababa. I mean, that was the claim. I don't think that claim is true. But the claim was, you know, we went around to the villages and we only told very specific people to come to Addis Ababa, which if you just think about it for a minute is like not really believable, but okay, leave that aside for a second. But they said, we didn't ask them to come. We're not responsible. They're not Jews. If we, you know, it's like stray cats. If you feed them, they will never go away. Don't feed them, and they will go back to their villages. They will find a place to go. That was one claim. Then there was the sort of, you know, guerrilla organizations like NACOJ, you know, which now is a respectable mainstream organization, but at the time everybody thought of them as a guerrilla organization. And they said no, and they were populated by Orthodox Jews primarily. And they said, no, they're Jews, they're penitents. Even if they did convert, they want to come back to Judaism, we have an obligation. And they, you know, I mean, one millionaire basically funded this, and they opened soup kitchens, and they, you know, and they opened a school, and there was a circus. They got all this equipment donated by Circus Olay, and you know they went around the capital with the kids, you know, doing incredible acrobatic tricks. It's not so incredible, but that's just one picture. Can you go on to the next picture, please? Right, kids watching the circus, you know, and there was a semblance of a normal life, and the cemetery. This is the day that 16-year-old girl was buried. There were a few people buried that day. All the 4,000 people or so in the compound stopped work and went to the funeral. And this is somebody else who's just showing me, a friend of mine who's showing me the grave of his father, who died while they were waiting in Addis Ababa. And you see the graves are not marked, so he took a piece of scrap metal and, you know, put it in the ground just as a marker. Please go on. Okay, there's a different view of the cemetery. You see some of them are like these concrete slabs. Those are the official graves that were put there by the Israeli embassy for the people who eventually went to Israel. And then the refugees who were left behind, you know, they didn't have that kind of support, so you see just these like mounds with rocks that they dug. And by the way, there's a small non-Ethiopian Jewish community in Addis Ababa. They were also split. They weren't happy that these people were being buried in their cemetery, because after all, I mean, everybody says they're not Jewish. What are they being buried in our cemetery for? And like, it's a whole complicated thing. And for the people left in Addis Ababa, having no place to be buried was almost worse than having no place to live. And that's what people talked about. Go ahead. Okay. Now, I'm going to short-circuit this story. Let me just tell you what happened. Around 1994, the government of Israel had a special interministerial committee headed by Yair Tsaban, who was then the Minister of Absorption of Immigrants. And they, you know, I mean, I was not called to testify, but every other academic, you know, who could, you know, even pretend to know something about Ethiopia was called upon to testify to this committee, and they made a lot of stuff up, but that's beside the point for another time. And the committee reached the following conclusion. They said, look, they framed the question this way, or some of the testimony did. They said, the question is this: how much Jewish solidarity do we owe these people? Which is not a binary way of framing it, right? It's not simply, are you Jews or not Jews, but how much Jewish solidarity do we owe these people? And that's a fairly sophisticated way of framing the question. I think Avi Ravitsky, came up with that language. He's a well-known academic in Israel. And they reached the following compromise. They say, here's what we're going to do. We don't want to just bring all these people on an airplane, but we can't just ignore them, and they're not going away, right? They've been sitting in this refugee camp now for 3 years. They're not going away, right? So even if we want them to go away, they're not. And the longer they sit there, the more people come, because there's a soup kitchen, so they come. So they said, here's what we're going to do. Anybody sitting in this camp in Addis Ababa who has a first-degree relative in Israel, a mother, father, sister, brother, child, can come to Israel. We'll send an airplane, 100 people a month, 200 people a month, and we're not going to do it an overnight airlift, but we'll get those people. Only if they have first-degree relatives in Israel. And we'll call it not aliyah, which is what Jews get to do. We'll call it family reunification. Humanitarianism. Okay, now in Israeli state policy, there's a tension between humanitarian law and Jewish law, if you want to use that terminology. So we can't bring these people on Jewish grounds, but we can bring them on humanitarian grounds. But a certain group of people in Israel, including a certain number of rabbis, thought this was an excellent opportunity to sort of have our cake and eat it too. Once those relatives come to Israel, if they want, they can go through an accelerated conversion program, which we'll call Return to Judaism, Hashava Yahadut, so they can get their identity card stamped Yehudi, and then they can bring their first-degree relatives from Ethiopia. So over the course of 2 or 3 years, everybody that I knew in Ethiopia came to Israel. However, every time an airload of people left Ethiopia to come to Israel, you know what happened? Another group of people came down out of the mountains. And so it's still going on today. So instead of the 3,000 or 4,000 people who were there in 1991 that they could have just taken an airlift and said, we're done, there have been another 20,000 or 30,000 people who have come, and they're still coming. They're still coming. And they almost all go through the Hashava Yahadut program, the Return to Judaism program, and then they bring their relatives. So by now, the people who are coming are people who have, then progressively less and less of a connection with Jewish relatives or with Judaism. I mean, they're more and more assimilated, if you will, or have been converted longer and longer time. And nobody knows how or if this process will ever end. Now, the story is not over. I'm going to end with the following story. In 1996, I was nearing the end of my fieldwork about this whole problem. And I thought I was getting ready to go home. And one day, a friend of mine calls me up on a Saturday night. And he says to me, have you heard about the demonstration that's going to be on Sunday? I said, no, I hadn't heard. He said, there's a big demonstration. And I never got phone calls like that, so I knew something was big. So Sunday morning, I got on the bus and I went to the Prime Minister's office, and outside the office there were 10,000 people. The total Ethiopian community at the time was about 70 or 80,000 people. So that's a huge number of people protesting. Why were they protesting? Because on Friday, which is the big news day in Israel, like you have the Sunday paper here, so there's the Friday paper in Israel. So the Friday paper had a picture on the cover of Ma'ariv with an Ethiopian soldier sitting on a gurney donating blood, and in the picture there was a garbage can under the gurney, and the blood was being dumped into the garbage. Now, of course, that's a made-up picture, right? But the truth behind the made-up picture was that an investigative journalist had broken the story that for a decade, Ethiopian blood donations were not being used as part of the public blood supply. They were being screened for infectious disease and then not used. And the reason was, as the public health authorities explained, was because Ethiopians had a higher rate of infectious disease, tuberculosis, hepatitis, and at that time, AIDS was a big concern. It wasn't a huge percentage, but it was a higher percentage than the rest of the population. And so they weren't using the blood donations, and somehow they had neglected to tell anybody that this was the policy. And Ethiopians were mad. And that was the first time I ever got tear gassed. I feel like it gives me some street credit and sense of authenticity because I was born in the 1960s. And at that demonstration, which was called the blood demonstration, 61 people were hospitalized. 41 of them were police and army officers. So just to give you a sense of how violent the demonstration. Nobody was killed, despite the fact that a lot of people carried guns. But it was a very angry, violent demonstration. And What Ethiopians said to me at the time, almost universally, was, they're not using our blood because they don't think we're Jewish. In other words, I never heard anybody say, they're not using our blood because there are these concerns about infectious disease or whatever. The universal opinion was, they're not using our blood because they don't want us, they don't think we're Jewish. And certain statements didn't help. Look at source number 5. This is the Jerusalem Post citing a Norwegian newspaper that interviewed Yasser Arafat. Remember Arafat, our good friend? Arafat said he expects civil war to erupt in Israel, in which Russian immigrants, half of whom are Christians or Muslims, will fight for a united Palestinian state. He also asserted that the so-called Ethiopian Jews are Muslims. Outlining his strategy, he said, the PLO will now concentrate on splitting Israel psychologically. If the Jews can import all kinds of Ethiopians, Russians, Uzbekians, and Ukrainians as Jews, we can import all kinds of Arabs. Okay, not a helpful statement for him to have made, but Yasser Arafat was not known for making helpful statements. This is a claim. What's the claim here? Right? You see, there's other things. This is not only an internal Jewish conversation. And by the way, most Palestinians believe this, that I have spoken to. In other words, not only like Yasser Arafat, but like Israeli Arabs. They say, Ethiopians, of course they're not Jewish. How do you know they're not Jewish? Well, they don't look like Jews, right? So, and they resent the fact that Ethiopians, and others came and are taking, homes and jobs that they consider to be theirs. It's like, it's not enough, the Jews, but like also you bring these other people? So claims to family membership are claims about politics. They're claims about resources. They're claims about who's responsible to whom. So Arafat had this to say. I'm going to end with source number 6. Can you, this is Neve Carmel. This is the camp in Haifa, where this also is the camp in Haifa where they had the Return to Judaism program. People lived in trailers for a couple of years. They were supposed to learn Hebrew. The kids started going to school, and they did the Return to Judaism program, at the end of which they had to go to the mikvah and immerse, and if they were men, they had to either be circumcised, or if they had been circumcised, have hatafat dam brit, which means a drop of blood being taken from their organ to symbolically re-circumcise, because being circumcised in Ethiopia is no guarantee that you were circumcised as a Jew. Okay, Christians also circumcised. It's sort of like in America where there's a lot of medical circumcision. So, and they had to pass an exam of some kind, although it wasn't very difficult. Everybody passed. I mean, everybody who wanted to passed. Nobody was turned away. Next slide, please. And this is a slide from the demonstration that I was at in Jerusalem. Here you see in English, apartheid, the second Holocaust, genocide in the Holy Land. I mean, these are, very aggravated claims. And of course in English, can you go to the next one, please? The same one from a different view, and one more. And here you see in Hebrew, this is a little bit different. You see what they said in English, and now you see in Hebrew from the same demonstration, it says, Dam Yehudi lo tishboch, right? Jewish blood, don't spill Jewish blood, which is a very powerful thing to say because it's Holocaust imagery, it's also imagery about terrorism, don't spill Jewish blood. And then it says, Shivyon chevrati mishtalem choser shivyon ma'ayem. Social justice pays off, or equality pays off. Lack of equality is a threat. Okay, it was a slightly different kind of an argument that was made in Hebrew, but the basic argument of the demonstrators was, we're Jews, which is an interesting thing, because a lot of people thought that was a non sequitur. What does that have to do with the blood policy? But from their point of view, that's of course what it was about. Are we members of the family, or are we not members of the family? Now, my final source here is from fieldwork that I did outside Haifa. Let me just tell you about this day, and this is the last story that I'm going to tell. It was 1996. It was a few months after the big demonstration. The government had set up an investigatory panel to basically ask questions but then bury the answers. I have one of the few copies of the report that they wrote. It has vanished from all the libraries as far as I can tell. It found that nobody was responsible, nobody made any mistakes. It was like one of those government reports. On this particular day in 1996 was the beginning of the horrendous wave of suicide bombings that started in late 96 when buses were exploding all over the country. On this day, 2 buses had exploded, one in Jerusalem, one in Ashkelon, and people were just sitting and watching the TV all day, and it was a very emotional time. And I was sitting in a trailer home with friends of mine, and this guy that I knew, Mulugeta, came over. He was an old immigrant. He came in Operation Moses back in the 80s, but he used to visit the new immigrants and provide services for them. And I shared with him the quote from Yasser Arafat that I just read to you. I had the newspaper clipping, and I said, what do you think about this? That's a great anthropological tool. And here's what he said. He said, that's true. Do you want to know why? I'll tell you. In Ethiopia, they didn't want us, and here they won't have us either. Someone who isn't wanted at the church and can't go to the synagogue, what is he? He's a Muslim. They have been throwing away our blood because they don't want us here. But I don't care what they think anymore. They're going to tell us to drop our pants, even old men. The Torah says to circumcise once at age 8 days, not twice. They have a rabbi who's dead. They say he's the Messiah. He's talking about the Chabadniks. Is that what the Torah says? That's just idolatry. He says, I know who I am, and if someone doesn't accept me, I don't care about them. I have children, and that's what I tell them to. And he's shaking with anger as he goes on this tirade. Then he stops, and he's quiet for a minute, and there's quiet, and he's a little embarrassed, and he sort of touches my knee, and he points at the TV screen where they're showing the carnage of the buses being blown up, and he says, I'm sorry. I don't really mean all that. I'm just so upset. And then pointing to the TV, he says, that's what I'm upset about. They are just killing us. Now, what is this whole story about? A funeral, a demonstration, a suicide bombing, a missionary encounter in the 1860s. All of these people are arguing about who belongs to who has responsibility for whom. And as an extension of that, how Israeli state policy should navigate questions of Jewishness and belonging. Now, there is a certain position that says that Israeli state policy shouldn't care about questions of Jewishness and belonging, and there should be a kind of separation of synagogue and state along the American model. But that's a very marginal opinion in Israel to this day. I think it's probably a marginal opinion among American Jews. I don't know. The mainstream in Israel can't help but think that the state, which was created for the sake of saving the Jews, has a special responsibility to save Jews. But saying that forces them to then answer the question, who are the Jews that they want to save? And what do you do about hard cases? This is a hard case. This is not right. I mean, there are now thousands of completely non-Jewish Eritreans and Somalis living in South Tel Aviv who are not making claims to Jewishness. They're just refugees who crossed the border because they were escaping a terrible situation. That's an easy case in a sense. I mean, it's hard on a policy level, but it's not. I mean, the issues are clear. Whereas the cases that we're dealing with are all hard cases because they involve complicated conversations about identity. Is it racial? Is it religious? Is it historical? Who gets to decide? And here's my soapbox moment. The talk that I just gave you is not a talk by a philosopher. I mean, I write that way sometimes. It's not a talk by an ethicist. If you come to these lectures every year, you'll hear a lot of ethicists, I presume. This is the way this is being framed by an anthropologist, and I'll tell you why. Because I want to make the argument that to actually have a serious ethical conversation, you first have to have a very clear understanding about what's going on and what's at stake for people. And make sure that, as the scholar of religion Bob Orsi once said, you got to make sure you got the damn story straight. And it seems to me that a messy story like this can't be covered from 10,000 feet. You can't figure it out just by knowing history. You can't figure it out just by reading the newspapers. You can't even figure it out just by interviewing a couple of people. You have to live intimately with people on the ground for a long time and find out what's going on with them, what makes it tick, what are the stakes for good and for bad, what are the life and death things that are being negotiated here. And then if you've done that, maybe you have a shot at having an intelligent conversation about what policy ought to be. I'm not here tonight, I mean, I have my own opinions, but I'm not here tonight to suggest what I think Israeli policy should be about Ethiopian or any other immigration or who's a Jew or anything like that. I have my own opinions, people have different opinions. But what I am here to say is that this way of thinking about things through the stories that people are living and not just through abstract evaluations, is enormously important. Enormously important. The United States now is trying to figure out or reframe immigration policy in very profound ways. Do we have the sense that we know what we're talking about? Do we have the sense that we got the damn story straight? And if you don't think so, what would it take to get the damn story straight? Because politicians and ideologues of whatever stripe have an interest in telling the story their way. It tells a story that they want to tell. And it seems to me that if you want to actually find out what's going on with people, you need a different strategy. So the anthropological story of ethics just starts from this. And this will be unsatisfying to many of you, but I'm going to double down anyway. If you want to tell an honest story, you have to first engage people where they live and let them tell you their stories. It doesn't mean you have to do what they want all the time, and policy is complicated. I'm not suggesting just, well, ask a bunch of people and do whatever they want. You might have policies that some people don't like. I mean, somebody's not going to like whatever policies you have. But you have to figure out how to get the story straight. And I think you do that by allowing the stories to be told, even though they can't be fit into the boxes that you want them to be fit. So just to shift this to the American conversation, and I'll stop for questions or comments, I don't care whether you're a Democrat or Republican or you think there should be open borders or closed borders. That's all ideology. What I want to know is, how do you know that you understand what's actually happening? And if you can't claim that you actually have a basis for understanding what's actually happening, why should we care what you think the policy should be? And I'll end with that. Thank you. My understanding is we have a half hour now for comments, conversation, questions.
I understand, I read a few days ago that there are still 9,000 people waiting to come from Ethiopia to Israel, and Netanyahu made a decision not to bring them in, which of course I expect will eventually be changed, and as pressure builds up, I want my relatives to come. The whole question, though, of what's the big problem with the Ethiopians, I think really wasn't touched. And that is, it's like the child whose name we dare not speak, racism. No matter how assimilated into Israeli culture they become, you can't change their color, and that color differentiates them. And I know that the people who came from the former Soviet Union understand racism very well, and they're very conscious of it, and they're very, very addicted to it. So you've got a lot of problems hooked up in that we haven't even touched.
Yeah, well, look, we're not going to be able to touch on it very much. The question of how to understand race and racism in Israel is complicated. It's not exactly like the United States. And I think Americans often want to read it as just kind of an American issue, but it's different. In other words, let me put it this way. Sure, no, I get it. I get it. No, there is racism, and there's been a lot of movement and demonstrations about that recently. People may disagree. I don't actually think that's what's driving immigration policy. I think that if you had a group of 30,000 or 100,000 people in Ethiopia today who had clear bona fides that they were Jews, I think the government of Israel would have no choice but to bring them, and people would grumble, but they would come. What's happening now is that the claim is they're not Jews. And that's really what's driving immigration policy. It's people arguing about who's in the family. Now, Are there people who think they can't be Jews because they're black? Sure, there are people like that, but I don't think that's the dominant narrative. Where you do hear that a lot, as you alluded to, is sometimes among Russian immigrants. You know, when I was working in near Haifa, so it was a big absorption center that was half Ethiopian and half Russian at the time, and you know, there were a few bad fights, and eventually, I mean, the Ethiopians they won, and the Russian kids were not able to go out on the basketball court or whatever because the Ethiopians were tougher than they were. And this was because some of the Russians had made some remarks about racial identity, which Ethiopians took exception to. But I think the mainstream in Israel is a little bit different because, unlike American Jews, I mean, there's a very wide range of skin tone, right, among Israelis. And again, people may argue with me, but I don't actually believe that color is the primary motor of this. Of course, I'm sure it contributes, but I don't think it's the primary motor. Other comments, questions?
Excuse me, may I?
Sarah, yes.
Hi. We were there, we led a small mission in 2006, 2007, and we were taken to Beit Shemesh, I believe it
Sure.
was. And we were taken to an absorption center
Yeah.
and to one of the early childhood centers. And I, at the time, was a volunteer in the LAUSD, Los Angeles Unified School District, reading aloud to small children once a week.
Yeah.
And I noticed on the bookshelves, for example, in both the absorption center and the early childhood center, that all the books depicted only white children. There were no, unlike our schools,
Yeah.
and we've had a horrible history here,
Yeah.
as we all know, where there are a great deal of books depicting all sorts of diversity of all different races. And this really struck me further when we heard along the way through different sites that we stopped at, remarks made that were akin to the kinds of things that we used to hear about black African American people here, lazy, shiftless, all the kinds of things you'd hear in the South, for example. Really offended us, really, and it seemed like.
Well, I take exception to that as a Southerner, but I think you heard it in the North too.
But
yeah.
Well, we were rather surprised, hoped that it would be otherwise, and as a matter
Yeah.
of fact, started a small book program, sending books over. That I had people there within the Ethiopian community receiving them and disseminating them to schools. But apparently, there's a problem,
Yeah.
and that's one thing to have the books. It's another thing to get them to where they could be read
Sure.
and shared.
Absolutely.
And I wondered if you could comment on that and how, because inside the country
Yeah.
and the getting along of people and
Yeah.
children tolerating children, and I kind of felt that's a beginning.
Yeah.
That's where it would help a great deal.
Yeah.
Is there
Look,
enough,
when
how do you
it
approach that?
when it comes to
acceptance.
anything having to do with just the way people talk to each other, so what can I tell you? Israel is not a politically correct society. People talk in ways that we cringe about in the United States now, but we cringe about it now. We didn't 20 or 30 years ago, and Israel is culturally about 20 or 30 years behind the United States. So, something like having different races depicted in a kindergarten or whatever, or in a learning center, I agree with you that it's important. I think it will come to Israel 20 or 30 years after it came to the U.S., which is around now. So this kind of stuff is starting to happen. A lot of Ethiopians are writing their own books and their own children's books, which I think is very important. But sure, I mean, these are real problems, and they have to be addressed. It's just not, tonight I was talking about a very specific problem, is how you determine immigration policy. But yes, when you talk about integration, it's a real problem, and people are divided internally within the Ethiopian community about how much integration there's been. I used to teach at Hebrew University. I had a student who wrote a paper critiquing the Ethiopian community for claiming racism for the problems that they face. And, he was not so popular. I mean, he was yelled at by a lot of people, but that's how he viewed it. So, I think like the United States, this is a complicated society. It's a complex society. And, people have a lot of different views. But I think it's widely accepted that there's some racism in Israel. The question is, how does it get manifested? What's racism and what's something else going on? You know, I had a friend of mine confided in me that he had a terrible experience because he had to talk to somebody in a government office, and you know, he waited politely online, and the woman just kept talking on the phone, and she was having a private conversation. You know how that is, right? You're waiting for the bureaucrat, and she's chatting with her friend, and the more he stood there, you know, she wasn't paying any attention to him, and he was an Ethiopian, so he was polite. And finally, he interrupted her, and she said something nasty to him. He said, "Oh, the racism." And, you know, I said to him, well, I have that experience all the time. So I can't tell you that it's not because you're an Ethiopian. Maybe it was. But that's not the only reason people have those experiences in Israel. It's you have to be pushy. And that's how the society works. If you're not pushy, you don't get anywhere. So, but, you know, in a paradoxical way, the more the Ethiopian community is upset and complains about racism, the more I feel like they really are Israeli. Yes. So I think that the question was, within the Ethiopian community in Israel, do people sort of think of themselves as Jews first, sort of returning from the exile, or as Ethiopians or Africans or something like that? So I think there's a lot of variation. It's a complex community like any other, and there's also been a change over time. So in the 1980s, I remember the people that I spoke to taking umbrage if you said that they were African or if you compared them to African Americans. You know, these were people, first of all, Ethiopians don't always consider themselves Africans, right, or black. This is the Horn of Africa. There's a lot of Semitic influence there. And, you know, Ethiopians traditionally have looked down on Africans from the rest of the continent. And this is a regional thing within Ethiopia as well, right? The Jews are part of that group that comes from the highlands that have, I mean, they speak a Semitic language, and they're very influenced by the culture of the Mediterranean and the Middle East. And the people that I met in the 1980s, you know, this was Jewish homecoming, and, you know, and they didn't want to go back to Ethiopia. But that has changed over time, in part because of the influence of popular culture, in part because of people's concerns about racism or the feeling that they're not fully accepted. And I think today, the idea of Ethiopians identifying sort of with African American culture or with blacks more generally is much more accepted. I don't think that's a bad thing. I mean, it's just a change. But I think if you talk to younger people, that is more natural than it was for their parents or grandparents. How much intermarriage is there between Ethiopians and other Jews in Israel? Not a whole lot, but there's some. There's some, you know. But why would an Ethiopian marry, you know, somebody pale like me? I mean, you know, like, they have so much better people to choose from. Yeah. Yes, ma'am. So there have been a lot of complaints by Ethiopians in the army that there are claims of discrimination. There was a period where there were a number of suicides by Ethiopian soldiers, which were blamed on discrimination. At the same time, the army has been, like it was for other immigrants to Israel, one of the main paths for integration and advancement. So, I mean, Ethiopians have done very well in the army, but there are persistent claims of discrimination. But what I would say is most of the discrimination is local. It's not like, you know, there's some big government policy. But it's, you know, some commander said something stupid or, you know, something like that.
Isn't it a fact that they did throw out all the blood that the Ethiopians did give? I went there.
Well, so it depends.
2014.
Not in the sense that they threw, right, there was no garbage can under the gurney where they threw the blood. Okay, here's what happened to the blood. All blood that was taken was first tested for HIV and other infectious diseases. Those people who had HIV or other infectious diseases were informed. Okay? Then the blood was autoclaved and discarded in the normal way that you discard donated blood. Right? So yes, it was not used. Yes, it was discarded. I mean, that's absolutely true. It's not true just, you know, sort of the visual of, you know, take your blood and throw it in the garbage. That's not how it happened. But yes, the blood was discarded, absolutely. And the reason for that, I mean, the medical reason for that, which, by the way, I actually, you know, I've written about this. I think the Israeli public health policy was wrong in many ways, but I personally think they were right not to use the donations. because the HIV tests that were available at that time had a 6-month window where if you had been infected within the past 6 months, it wouldn't show up on the test. And given the percentages, look, to put this in a little perspective, the same thing was happening in the mid-1990s in the United States. In the early 1990s, when AIDS became known as a real problem, and it was associated in the United States with Haitians in particular, so they would have blood drives in public schools in New York. And they would make announcements over the loudspeaker, except for Haitians, right? In 1994, so we're only talking about 2 years before this happened in Israel, there was a huge demonstration in New York. They shut down the Brooklyn Bridge, and they forced the government to change the policy to something more reasonable, which is what the policy is today, which is you don't discard blood because of someone's ethnicity. You only discard blood because of either their behavior or their geographical location. So, when you give blood today, they say, have you been in a country endemic to AIDS in the last 10 years? They don't just say, are you Ethiopian, right, or are you Haitian? So they had to make that same transition in Israel, and they did it around, 2 or 3 years later, but around the same time. Okay? So you always, as a public health person, you have to weigh the demands of equality and the demands of how you protect the public health. And that's sometimes a hard balance to strike. Where I think that they were wrong in an almost criminal way in the public health authority in Israel was 2 things. First of all, you can't have a secret policy. You have to tell the community what you're doing. Tell people, right? And here's the really damning thing, and this is related to our talk, so I wasn't going to talk about this, but I'll just mention. In this investigative commission that they put together, and they had, weeks and weeks of testimony of different people coming in, and I sat in the audience, listening to all of this. They were never able to pin the decision on who made this decision, what to do about the blood, to anybody. Right? It was like it just happened, nobody took responsibility. Probably it was Ehud Olmert because he was the Minister of Health at the time when this started, but nobody knows, right? Like it's a miracle. But if you look at the protocols of the public health authorities, you notice something very damning, which was not acknowledged by the commission, although it was in one of the minority reports by the one Ethiopian member of the commission. I think she was right. She said, if you look at what they didn't treat the Ethiopian community as a community with a public health problem that we need to solve. They treated the Ethiopian community as people who are bearers of contagion to the public blood supply that we need to be protected against. And that, I think, is an incredibly damning conclusion, but it's not one that was ever really addressed in public discourse in Israel. And the Ethiopian community itself backed away from it, didn't push it. They got a few changes made, and they said, put a few people in Knesset, Disu Masala, whatever, and, So there was a lot of, I think, bad faith around the way that the aftermath of this was handled. But I don't think the actual decision not to use the blood was the wrong decision. So I just have a different take on this than a lot of people have. And it gets to, again, who's in the family. So if, as a public health doctor, you're thinking, these are people that are my responsibility to take care of their health, you have one set of policies. If you think I'm responsible for the public, but the public somehow doesn't include these people, then you come up with a different set of policies. And I think that's where the real critique lies. Anybody else? Sir.
I thought it was interesting, the term absorption.
Yeah.
I thought it was interesting, the term absorption for the absorption centers. It's been a long time since I took chemistry, but that process is one of changing the substance being absorbed so that it gets mixed in and doesn't much change what it's been absorbed by.
Just to be fair, because I've made this argument too, but people usually yell at me. So just to be fair, that's the English translation, right? The Hebrew is klita, which can mean absorption, but it can also mean understanding, right? It can also mean, so the Hebrew is a little bit more.
Well, okay, yeah. But my comment really relates to the slightly broader view. The state of Israel, or some Israel officials have said that Israel cannot be expected to participate in the general world attempt to respond to the Syrian and
Yeah.
whatever else it is, Tunisian.
Right, the refugee crisis. Yeah.
Refugee crisis because it's very small and it can't absorb, and maybe it doesn't make a big point of it, but I've always presumed on hearing that they're also saying, and we have a special role that we have to be able to do because there are lots of countries that can absorb, quote, refugees.
Right.
Nobody really wants to absorb the Jews.
No, I think that's true. Look, I don't think this is subtle. I think Israel has defined itself from the beginning as the state of the Jewish people, and that that brings certain kinds of difficult questions to the fore. Because look, most modern states, although they are implicitly the state of a particular national entity, the laws are not set up that way, with a few exceptions. I mean, in Germany and Spain, there are laws that favor immigration of people of that ethnicity. In Japan, you cannot immigrate to Japan unless you are the child of Japanese parents or the grandchild of Japanese parents born abroad. And then they have special policies. You know, there are thousands upon thousands of Japanese born in Brazil who are now going back to Japan as guest workers. And the reason, why are they bringing Japanese, right? Why aren't they just bringing regular Brazilians? They don't want them, right? They want to maintain that homogeneity. So I'm not saying that this is an easy question, but it's not one unique to Israel. It's a question that other countries are wrestling with. And, that'll have to be a topic for another time, but I think many, not all, many Israelis feel that Israel has a special role in being the state of the Jewish people, and that diluting that too much is not something that they want to do. But yeah.
I wonder, do most of the Ethiopians, Jews in Israel, tend to support or be identified with any one particular political party?
Less so than used to be the case. Less so than used to be the case. But I think still, correct me if you think I'm wrong, but I still think overwhelmingly they vote Likud. Because the Likud party was in power when they were brought to Israel. Although Adisu Masala, the first Ethiopian Knesset member, served in the Labor Party, when he visited towns where I was working, people threw rocks at him and chased him away because they blamed the Labor Party for not being willing to let them immigrate for many years, and Shimon Peres in particular. So there's a long history, but I think that now it's becoming more diversified. I mean, I know Ethiopians vote for Shas, so I think the younger people are less kind of in that block, but at the time, early on, they were sort of, every family that I knew had a picture of Yitzhak Shamir and Menachem Begin on the wall, and Rambo, and, over time that has vanished a little bit.
I have a question.
Please.
You made a comparison to the United States immigration policy, but I just do not recall even people that want to open the gates to immigration saying, we should let them in because they're one of us.
Yeah.
That just doesn't seem, I don't see the comparison.
Well, look, the United States is framed differently, but let me give you what I think is an analogy. I don't know if this is still true today, but certainly for many, many years, if you could claim that you were a refugee from communism, you got into this country, no questions asked. If you were what's called a political refugee, if you were an economic refugee, they didn't want to talk to you, right? Now, of course, the problem is that if you're coming from Nicaragua or, right, so, who's to say? I mean, how do you, you're both, right? Because you're fleeing oppression and you're fleeing poverty, and it's hard to separate the two. But the United States made a decision as part of its overall strategic policy that it wanted to weaken world communism by showing that there was an alternative and we'll accept it. So it's not the same. It's not a family claim. It was an ideology claim. And the United States is grounded in, the United States and Israel are different kinds of countries because the United States doesn't officially claim to be the state of a nation. If you sort of know what I mean, right? We talk about the American people, but we don't really mean it. I mean, the American people are just, from everywhere. But many states are states of a particular nation. So, if you're an ethnic German, you can still immigrate to Germany. And now Spain, by the way, just passed a law that not only Christians, but Jews, if they can show that they are descended from Spanish Jews, they can claim citizenship. That's going back hundreds of years. So I think America might be a bad example simply because the political system is so different. Did that?
That's what I would say. It just doesn't seem parallel in the same way.
Right, no, it is different. But what I do want to point out, though, is the United States does make ideological decisions about which immigrants it wants and which ones it doesn't. And it's always done so. I mean, either based on their economic needs at the moment or based on some perceived political need.
And certainly 100 years ago, the Canada Act
For sure, for sure, for sure.
was just like the Nuremberg Law.
For sure.
Who are your grandparents?
Right.
Where did they come from?
Right.
And we don't care what passport you're carrying.
Right. And by the way, I'll say this only among friends, but those people who 100 years ago or whatever were afraid about all the Jews immigrating to the country because they thought it was going to change the country, well, it did. Of course it did. Right? The country today is very different because of the influx of Jews. And, I'm happy about it. I don't think it's a bad thing. But it's certainly not crazy for them to have thought that. Jews have pulled and pushed certainly the intellectual framework of the country through their involvement in organizations like the ACLU and civil rights and just, comedy. I mean, think about the cultural contribution that Jews have made. You can't really imagine what America would be like today if Jews hadn't immigrated. So those people who now are saying, well, if we have all these immigrants, Muslim immigrants, the country's going to be different. Well, of course it will. Of course it will. I mean, that's just the honest truth. So it strikes me, again, like I don't, of course I care what immigration policy people have, but from my perspective here tonight, I don't care what anybody's particular view of what immigration policy should be. I just care that we can actually have an honest conversation and try to get the story straight and figure out what we're actually talking about, instead of just what we kind of would like to imagine that the reality is. And that's a hard thing to do. It's not simple. Anybody else? Yeah, last question maybe, yeah.
So at this time, does Israel cooperate with Ethiopia when it comes to immigration, or does it all?
No, today everything is done, by agreement. There's no secret airlifts anymore. I mean, this is all done by agreement. But I will tell you that, even in 1993 when I was there, I didn't get to talk about this. It's not so relevant. I was deported from Ethiopia. I was arrested and thrown out of the country with another group of Americans I was there doing sort of research. There was a group of Americans who were there at the same time who were working for NACOJ doing Jewish education in Addis Ababa for these people who were left behind. I cooperated with them a little bit, but I was having dinner at their house that they rented one night, and all these police descended and they took everybody's passport and they just drove everybody to the airport. And that was, I think, a decision actually by the state of Israel to pressure the government of Ethiopia to kick these people out, because Israel at that time did not want these people to be immigrating. And of course, the more that you strengthen their sense or other people's sense that they were Jews, the more likely it was they were going to be immigrating. So there's been close cooperation, for better and worse, between these two governments. Where it becomes more complicated is, again, as I mentioned, that the Ethiopian church is unhappy with the idea that people whose grandparents converted to Christianity are now claiming to be Jews. They're not happy with that. And the Ethiopian church is very powerful, not as powerful as it used to be, but that does make things sometimes dicey. They have to figure out how to handle that. All right. I want to thank everybody for coming. I know it's late, and I really appreciate your being here.